everybody in the world has a story they want to tell. People love telling stories to each other. It's kind of the currency of humans. I travel all over
Right.
in my job and people tell stories all over the world. It's definitely
Right.
a thing people like to do. But I do think you just need to have the confidence that you can do it and give it a try. I mean, what's the worst that can happen, really? There's no real downside.
Welcome to the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. My name is Savannah Gilbo, and I'm here to help you write a story that works. I want to prove to you that writing a novel doesn't have to be overwhelming. So each week, I'll bring you a brand new episode with simple, actionable, and step-by-step strategies that you can implement in your writing right away. So whether you're brand new to writing or more of a seasoned author looking to improve your craft, this podcast is for you. So pick up a pen and let's get started. In today's episode, I have something super fun to share with you. I recently sat down for a conversation with James Beswick, one of the writers who took my Notes to Novel course earlier this year, and we talked about his outlining, writing, and editing journey over the last 12 months. To give you a quick overview of James's amazing accomplishments, he enrolled in the Notes to Novel course in January. He finished a fully fleshed out outline by March, and then he had his 80,000 word first draft written by June. And at the time of recording this episode, it's mid-September, James is now working through his second draft. So he did all of that. He took the course, he outlined his novel, he wrote his first draft, all of that over the last 9 months. And that's pretty cool, right? So in the conversation I'm going to share with you today, James shares some advice for writers who might be struggling to get started. Like most of us, James is a very busy guy with a full-time job and a family, so I think you're going to like hearing how he was able to carve out the time to outline and write his first draft. He also shares how the genre framework that I teach inside of the Notes to Novel program and that I've gone over on this podcast before, he talks about how that finally took the overwhelm out of the outlining and writing process for him. And funnily enough, James says that he now suffers from the opposite of writer's block. So it's no longer that he struggles to get the writing done. It's now more like he has so many ideas and a writing method that works that he can more or less pick and choose which idea he wants to work on next. And that is a pretty great place to be if you ask me. So this is a jam-packed episode with my wonderful and talented student, James Beswick, and I'm so excited to share his story with you. So without further ado, let's just jump right into the conversation. Welcome, James, and thank you for coming on the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Savannah. It's great to be here.
Sure. Yeah. And you have a really fun story when it comes to deciding to write a book, going out and finding the help you need to make it happen, and then basically cranking out a pretty solid first draft in a handful of months, right?
It's been pretty much a whirlwind. I'm kind of amazed I got to this point in some regards, but yeah, it's incredible to think where it all started from and where we're at so far in the process.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about all that. We're going to dive deep into kind of each step you took to get there. But I think your story is a great example of what's possible for people. And I know it's going to inspire so many people just by hearing your story and hearing you talk about the struggles you had and even the aha moments and things like that. So let's start at the very top. Tell people who you are, what you're all about, what kind of books you like, what kind of books you write, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, so my name is James Beswick. In real life, I work in software, nothing to do with writing. But I do a lot of writing in my work, just technical writing and presenting to people and that kind of stuff. But really, for the longest time, I've thought about writing a book. I suppose many people have, but it's one of those things that sits in the back of your mind and really haven't done anything with it for a very, very long time. And then at some point during the pandemic, I think I'd watched everything on Netflix, read everything I could get my hands on, and decided it was time to probably, see if I could write that book. Generally when I'm reading things, I do like reading a lot of young adult stuff, but I'd also read pretty much anything. So I'm someone who tries to read 8 to 10 books a year. Work life interrupts. I wouldn't claim I'm the most avid reader of all time, but I do enjoy generally reading.
Yeah, that's cool. So like I said, we're going to talk through your writing journey. I'm going to give people a highlight reel, and then we're going to go deeper. So your highlight reel is that you, like you just said, you wanted to write a book. You enrolled in Notes to Novel in January. You had an outline done by, I think it was March, right?
Yep.
And then we had a first draft done by June, July. Then you got a manuscript evaluation, and I'm guessing you're working on your second draft.
Yes. Yeah, that's pretty much exactly right.
Congratulations, because that is it's September now when we're recording this. That's 9 months of actually going out, taking the action to write a book, outlining a whole draft that was solid. drafting by June, July, and then being done or almost done with the second draft, I'm sure.
Yeah, a lot of it came down to planning. So the first time that the notes and novel came around, I didn't join the course because I couldn't commit enough time in my work. And I just thought there was no point in signing up if I couldn't really make that commitment. So I waited until January until I knew my work life would calm down and I could really put the time in. But, I spent a lot of time going through the materials and doing all the exercises and really soaking up all the information. But then it came down to really, how do you carve time out of your life to do this thing? Because, we're all busy. I'm not different to anybody else, but I found that there was a routine where I could take an hour every morning from 6 till 7 before work started. And then I'd take 3 or 4 hours each day at the weekend. And although at the beginning it felt like very small steps, you're just not getting that much out. Over time, I was able to pick up pace and close the gap. So I didn't create an artificial deadline saying, it must be done by this time.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to see daily progress on the.
Yeah. And that's so important too. I think a lot of people get so focused on that, I'm going to have it done in 6 months. And then it starts to put all this pressure on the process. Where if you do take the small baby steps, like you're saying, it's like pushing a boulder downhill, it picks up speed, it picks up moss, all that. But also structure wise in a story, once you get over a certain hump, it's like we start closing all the loops. So it actually does get easier if we just dig in and do the work. But I'm curious. So let's rewind. Even before you joined Notes to Novel, what had you tried anything else to write a book, or what was that pre-Notes to Novel period like?
I'd occasionally opened Microsoft Word and sort of looked at the blank screen and even got to a couple of templates where you get that kind of double spacing effect and written a couple of paragraphs. And it really was not going anywhere fast because you just don't know what you're doing. And the problem is that I think you think about authors as being these people who just, spew out brilliance. They sit in front of the word processor and do this. And so I pretty quickly realized that I wasn't going to get to anything approaching a book length by doing that. And that's when I decided to look.
Yeah. And it's such a good point because we all compare ourselves to published books. I do it still too. Or we look at an author, I always look at the Harry Potter series and I'm like, how did she think of all this stuff? It wasn't done on the first draft. So it's like, I have to remind myself of that every day. But okay. So then when you were out in the world looking for help, what made you choose the Notes to Novel course?
So a long time ago, I'd done some work around looking at Save the Cat as a concept. So I was really interested in screenwriting a couple of decades ago, and was always thinking of that. And so I thought originally I'd look at that again because I had this great idea that if you could write a screenplay, you could probably write a novel because they're the same thing, right? And then I'd looked up online and found some pieces you'd written about how Save the Cat mapped to novel writing. But then I started looking at more things you'd written and more of the tools you put out there. And that's when I thought, Savannah seems to really be an excellent teacher in this space. So I started going down the road of discovering it that way. And I suppose that's my entry point because it's just the Save the Cat model from a long time ago worked well for me when I was just getting into the screenplay side of things. But honestly, it doesn't work very well in the novel concept. So it's funny to see the journey from where I thought that would work out perfectly to seeing where it doesn't really help that much.
Yeah. And it's so funny because I either meet people who are like, I wanted to write a screenplay and I thought it would be easy to write a novel, or they're the opposite. Like, I'm going to write a novel because I think it might be easier to write a screenplay. So it's so funny. We think these are the same things. And, I could go on a tangent about this, but I work with a lot of people who come from screenplay writing. And a novel is an entirely different beast because you have to show like the interiority of the character, and you don't have producers and directors that are going to help you make this into reality,
Yeah, I think when I originally started, I had this really crazy idea that, you sort of write a novel and then just sort of tip out the screenplay over a weekend because, hey, you've done the novel.
All the hard work's done.
I can see at this point that's kind of lunacy. I mean, it's basically the difference between drawing an architecture of a house and building out a bathroom. They're not really the same task.
I mean, geez, I wish it was that easy and straightforward, but it is not. Okay, so then you found the Notes to Novel course. Was there anything that you were worried about or anything, did you have doubts about joining?
Well, originally just the time was my doubt. I thought, could I really invest the time necessary given work? And that was really a concern. So that's why I missed the first one and waited.
Yeah.
Getting to the second time, I didn't really have any doubts because I was very, very anxious to do this. It got to the point where I don't know if people remember the depths of the pandemic, but it's, you just want to do something with meaning of your time sitting around.
Right.
So I really, at that point, mentally committed to it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I wasn't worried about the quality of my work because I'm not trying to compete with anybody out there. I'm simply doing it for my own sense of what I want to do.
Right.
But so really, more it's just the anxiety, I suppose, is just how do you take those first baby steps into writing the novel.
Have you been dreaming of writing a novel, but you don't know where to start? Or maybe you've tried writing, but you keep getting stuck halfway through a draft? If so, I have a free training you're going to love. It's called 3 Things You Need to Write Your Novel in 2025, and in this free 60-minute training, I'll share the exact same process my clients and students have used to go from idea to completed manuscript in just months, not years. You'll also learn why most writers never finish their drafts, and spoiler alert, it's not a lack of talent or good ideas, as well as how to overcome feelings of perfectionism, self-doubt, and overwhelm that stops many new writers in their tracks. You can register for this free training at savannahgilbo.com/masterclass. So one more time, that's savannahgilbo.com/masterclass to register for the free training. I hope to see you there. Yeah, to achieving something that you dream of achieving, right?
Mm.
And so I get a question a lot, and I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, do you think it was right to defer the time, or do you think it would have been fine if you joined in November?
That's a great question. I mean, I think you should defer the time if you have to. Like, if it's an excuse, just so you don't, because you have doubts and you want to push it off, don't do that. Just then make the time. In my case, just because of my job, I really knew that I would not be able to squeeze it in. But then I also committed mentally I was going to immediately do it in the January course. So I knew that I would just push. But I know many people would like to just push it off because it's hard and it's something I don't have time for. And I wouldn't recommend that. I think if you're ready to go, just...
Yeah. And it's so funny because I always tell people kind of what you just said. Like, if you literally have a good reason to defer, go ahead and defer it. Just make a plan for, tapping back into whatever that dream is. But yeah, okay. So that's cool. So then you got in the course, and what was that experience like?
It was amazing, actually, because I think as someone who's read lots of novels, not written any, you have real no idea of what the process is, what the mechanics are underpinning it. So you throw back the curtain on what's going on behind the scenes, stories, and some of your presentations on genre and key scenes. It's just extraordinary because it's kind of obvious because we all read novels. Yeah, of course, but of course it's not obvious until it's shown to you,
right? And
you can see it. And so it's really those first sessions are very illuminating on understanding how you can fit into this existing world of how things get built. And I think that takes away all the terror of just, there's 80,000 words to write and a bunch of blank paper.
Yeah. What do I do with that?
Right.
Yeah. And I actually had a note because I hate calling one of the modules the most important because I'm biased and I think they're all important. But I do have to say the genre module is probably the most important because it gives you that framework, and it starts to say, okay, you kind of pick a lane. Maybe, people are always worried, what if I pick the wrong genre? It's okay. You pick a lane, you go with it. And then that tells you kind of the lens or the flavor that you're going to look at everything else through. So your outline, your characters, your theme, literally everything, right?
Yeah. And that gives you those guardrails as well, where you want to still obviously be creative throughout the process. But at some point you need to start limiting where you're going so you can actually focus on the chunks of work. Right. I think the genre piece is the most important. You just immediately find what genres you're working with, what you've got to do. And as you say, it's really just a framework. I think people panic in case it's some sort of formula and it's going to restrict their creativity.
Yeah.
In reality, it's more just knowing the steps that you have in front of you.
Right. And then you can choose what you do with them. Was it hard to choose the genre for your book?
In my case, surprisingly not, because I realized by looking at the genre list, things I don't really have so much interest in versus the ones that I do.
Yeah.
And I think it came down to a couple of genres I was a bit torn between. I read contrasting points they had to have. And then I very quickly found the ones that I think my book.
Yeah. And you landed on action with an internal worldview arc, right?
Right.
And I guess this would be a good time do you have like a blurb, or can you describe your book quickly? I know it's putting you on the spot.
So essentially, my book is about a teenager who's basically has run away from home because he's been accused of a crime, and he's living essentially off the grid down in Florida. And then events happen where he's called back home, where he has the ability to make things good again and repair events in the past through some magic there. And so it takes him on a journey to essentially restore his name with his family, reconnect with friends from his past.
Yeah. And one thing that's cool about your story, I'm just going to like add a layer to that, is that I can't remember if you said this, but he was falsely accused of a crime. So in a way, going back home, he can clear up some, I'm trying to say it without like spoiling it. He can clear up some of the mistakes and issues that he created by leaving. He can also clear his name, reconnect with some of the people that he misses in his life and all that fun stuff. So, okay, so that's great because I think we're probably going to get into a little bit more specific. So I wanted to get a blurb. But yeah, his life is at stake as he navigates all this. So I think you're right that yours might have been a little more straightforward to choose the genre. But I could also see you arguing like maybe at a point in your head, was it thriller? Is it crime? Is it, something else? But I think you made the right choice landing on action. So you picked your genre, you went through the course, fast forward to, I believe it was March when you had a finished outline. Mm-hmm. So that's at most 3 months from starting the course to having an outline. What was it like to create an outline?
Terrifying.
Yeah. Are you naturally a plotter?
I think I'm not. I'm somewhere in the middle where I like to see where something goes and zoom out and then try to get some structure around it. Then when it feels too vague, zoom back in.
Yeah.
So I'm somewhere there. And I'd looked at outlining before just as a broad technique and just gotten lost because it's just a massive, massive journey. I think what was different here was that you'd given us some guardrails in terms of finding the key events in your story from front to back, what the catalysts were, the act breaks were, final scenes and so forth. And so using that, I was able to break it down into quarters. And once I knew what had to happen by the beginning and end of each quarter, figuring out 10 scenes in each quarter was a much smaller challenge than, 80,000 words.
Right.
And at that point, I was able to then dissect it. Another key piece of advice that you gave was absolutely critical, was this idea that one scene follows the next, which again, it sounds obvious, but you don't think that way when you're writing. And so once I'd realized that all the events are inevitable, one flows from the other to the next to the next, suddenly it accelerated the ability to, I think in that 3 months, I sat 6 weeks with an empty outline and another 4 weeks with a very vague outline. And suddenly it came together for it.
Yeah. And I think that's how it happens for a lot of people that embrace the whole process and the idea that it's not going to be perfect right away. I find a lot of people to overthink that cause and effect, where it's like they kind of dismiss the fact that there's a character who, if you've created or fleshed him or her out in a way that is real, they're going to help you make the decisions just based on like what a human would naturally do. So did you find any of that where you were kind of like, gosh, this is a little easy?
Yeah.
Like, is that weird that it's easy?
Yeah. And a couple of other things you'd added that really helped. One was this idea of fundamentally the character has to have stakes they choose between in each scene.
Yeah.
But also you have to describe internally what they're thinking in each scene. You added that as something to work on. That was actually magic because when you put those two together, suddenly things happen. You don't have scenes where someone just shows up and has a cup of coffee and chats and they all agree and they leave. And it gets rid of those problematic scenes where nothing seems to be moving forward or like, why is it here? It becomes much leaner in its telling.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so funny because, it's funny, but it's also what writers end up spending a lot of time on is they'll have all this like fat in their draft. And it's like, scenes where people get coffee. And then it's like the woman goes to the store and she buys a dress. And then it's like, what are we doing here? So I think, that cause and effect chain from scene to scene, and also making sure there's that like goal conflict decision set up through each scene. If you can, on this podcast, we've talked about that in different episodes, but if we can keep that in mind, it just helps eliminate potential future issues.
Yeah, I did find I had to become more difficult to my hero because I've realized in the past I was just being too nice to the guy.
Right.
And really beating up your hero in Act 1, putting him to a place where they've got no choice but go down this journey you want. And then you're revisiting beating them up again towards the end of Act 2. Really just making it more extreme and more difficult. Although it felt painful at the beginning, I think made the dramatic elements better in the story.
Well, and it's back to that truth of like, people don't change unless we face conflict, right? Because we'll sit on the couch all day if nothing's pressuring us to do something else. So Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest things writers have to deal with is putting their character through something difficult, because we all identify with our characters to some extent. So we don't want to go through something difficult.
Right.
But yeah, so I remember there was a time through the notes to novel course that you sent your outline in for feedback. And there was like 3 main things that I remember saying. One was that you really did do a great job with the internal aspect of each scene. I remember that. And you just said that was a huge help. So I think that's kind of fun that you paid a lot of attention. It paid off because your outline was strong. And then there was a few notes about making decisions in each scene. Like some scenes you had your character face a choice. Other ones we needed to beef that up. And then there were a few scenes where I was like, I don't know if we need this, or maybe we should move this here and there. Right. Do you remember anything else big?
Yeah, I think those are the major things. And then it became this trick of how you could collapse a couple of scenes into one, or just do some compositing tricks, putting things together, or just removing them entirely. I remember the outline I changed probably 25 or 30% based on your feedback. And the funny thing is I'd shown it to my wife, and she's an avid reader but doesn't know the mechanics of this. And so I showed her the first one and showed her the second one. And her reaction was, oh, this is much better. And she didn't know why, but she just read it as being much, much more engaging and just more to the point, basically.
That's so cool. And so that must have felt good because you're like, well, she noticed a difference right away. My hard work's paying off. But yeah, you did a lot of groundwork. You did a lot of the hard work during the outlining phase. So what was it like when it came time to actually write the draft?
I was really ready at that point, funnily enough. I felt that I had the roadmap, and it was all just a series of, 42,000 word chunks at that point, more or less.
Yeah.
And so that's when I got into this day-by-day routine of just seeing what I could chew off each day. And I think initially it's hard. You're opening the blank page, and it's chapter 1, such and such happens. And that's
Lots of pressure.
terrifying. Lots of pressure. This has to be, publishable version 1 or something. But I think once you let that go and you just start producing words, it's critical. And then you said something as well that I thought really helped, was that don't edit what you've written, just keep moving forward. And so I'd written some real absolute terrible stuff. It just wasn't good. I was just getting from point A to point B, but it got me into the process. But I didn't then go back and then fix it, or when there were logical errors or missing characters. I just kept going until I'd essentially blasted through 80,000 words. And at that point, almost cloud lifts, because you can say, well, I did it. I completed the challenge of writing this much stuff. Now I just have to make it.
Yeah. And imagine, because it's very hard not to edit what you've written, but imagine if you had spent that time editing. You wouldn't have finished then with your first draft. You may not have finished even now. I mean, who knows, depending on how long you went back to edit. But also, because you said the clouds lift, and I think that is the best feeling for a writer to get to, when even though there's issues, it's like, okay, I know what this is, or I know what it wants to be. Now I can kind of make decisions for how I want to tweak things to make it that. Is that how you felt? Exactly.
And there's something else that happened over the course of this, and doing the course with you, is that you realize the book isn't a final fixed thing.
Right.
It's a liquid piece of work that moves around any way you want it to. And once you accept that, it becomes very liberating, because essentially you can have good parts, missing parts, whatever you want. It's just finding that path through, and only really gets locked at the very end when you choose. And you don't realize that coming into this as a new writer. So to me, that was just incredible. Just the sense of, well, I could move this character here, or take this person out, or make this happen earlier. This never really dawned on me.
Right. And I think it's hard for a lot of writers, A, because we compare ourselves to published works, but then also B, it's like we spend so much time, let's say, writing a side character that then we realize might not need to be there. If we have spent all this time and we're not coming into it with this fluid mindset of like, I want to tell the best story that I can, and I want to convey a certain message, then we're going to get stuck in those weeds of like, but this character, it took me so long to figure out their motivations and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Even if it doesn't match the vision you have for it, it's like you hang on to it because you've spent so much time doing it. And I think you were able to skip over a lot of that because you went into it with a mindset of like, this is going to be something that's living and breathing. It is going to take multiple drafts. So was that hard to hold that mindset?
I mean, there are definitely days when you're doing it where it's very lonely as a process. I mean, if you sat there by yourself writing, it's not like you've got a million people to talk to about it. And even though people want to be supportive and helpful, they don't really know what you're doing mentally with the thing. And so there's definitely points where you can feel this is hard, and it is hard.
Yeah.
But I think it's funny because after about 30 or 40% what was written, it started to become real. And it was much more like I was telling the story of some people I once knew, instead of it being this stick figure drawing.
Isn't that funny?
It was very strange. I've never had this experience before, but it's really bizarre how it just comes to life. And then you're kind of just finding the right words to describe the thing that happened.
Right. Yeah, because you had done so much work to flesh out your character, whose name is Jonah. And if you do that kind of work up front, they do become real. And it's not anymore James moving Jonah around the chessboard. It's Jonah saying, I'm taking this action because of who I am and because of what happens. But yeah, I think that's really cool. And then so come June, July-ish, you were done with your first draft. So from January to June, July, you had outlined and you had finished an 80,000 word first draft. What made you decide that it was time to get some outside feedback?
So I think the big mystery here is you just have no objectivity at that point. And, I've written versions of scenes that changed. I don't even remember the final state at that point when you just literally just stepped out of it. And you wonder, is this something that flows? Because my basic goal with this was to produce something entertaining more than anything. Yeah. And so I first gave it to my wife, and she was the first reader. So go read this and see what you think. And I knew the real test there was, would she get through it? Because if she didn't, there's a problem.
Yeah.
But even past that stage, I really wanted professional help with it in terms of telling me, okay, what works and what doesn't work here? Where should you push more, take things away and move it around? And so although I'd finished at that point, and it was really a wonderful day, I will remember it forever, just that first, first draft finish. But at that point, I knew that there was more work to do.
And how did you feel about your draft at that stage? Like, I know the feeling of finishing it was very exciting, but were you like, I can't believe I wrote something that feels like an actual story?
Yeah, I did. And funny enough, I put it into the Kindle format, and I was on a long flight, so I could read it on the Kindle like it was a book I bought. And this weird, being the same formatting and everything, this really is like a book. It isn't terrible. But at the same time, I knew that it's just, I had some doubts because I knew that I'd gotten better at writing various things as you progressed. And I knew the earlier stuff wasn't as good as the later stuff. And I also thought there was some plot lines and things questionable and maybe didn't work so well. But I needed someone else to tell me that. I knew that most of that, I was just in the back of my mind thinking, if I was doing it again, I wouldn't do it this way. But you just need that second voice, I think.
And what did your wife think when she read it? Did she finish?
Yeah, she finished it. She really liked it.
Good.
There's a couple of surprises in the book she didn't see coming. She didn't get confused anywhere. But yeah, I think that she was happy with it. But ultimately, there's not much more feedback she can give me because all I really need from her is it entertaining? Does it work? But beyond that, it's just she can't help me. I need more help than that.
And that's most of our friends and family and even some fellow writers, it's really hard unless we're kind of trained in this ability, which some people are. Some people do, they're very good at giving beta reader feedback, but most of the average human it's just not their skill set. We hear this thing on the internet that Act 2 is going to be the hardest to write. I actually think Act 1 is the hardest to write because like you said earlier, your skill set is, it's not developed 100% yet. You're kind of finding your rhythm. You're finding your characters. A lot of people put a ton of pressure on Act 1. So it's almost like this self-inflicted cage we put ourselves in. And then we get stuck in Act 1. So that's why I think it's the hardest. But did you find that there was a harder section to write?
For me, the second half of Act 2 is the hardest because I felt that the growing complexities and the things that have to happen to raise stakes actually really pressure test your story.
Yeah.
And it's easy to find not enough happens there or it's just not good enough. And then when you start looking at that, it does then feed back into the things you've not done in Act 1. So a lot of these things are kind of connected over the course of it. I found the same with Act 3. Act 3, I've got a fairly clear idea of the thing that and the skills that the hero needed to get through and the big surprises. So I was able to put those back fairly early on. But it was that second part of Act 2 because it's just such a long act. I mean, it just feels like it's never going to end.
Yeah, which I like what you said earlier that you thought about it in terms of quarters. So each like quadrant of the story, which that's how I like to look at it too. I think that's really smart. But yeah, Act 2 tests your characters and all that. It also tests your creativity and your skill as a writer, like you said, to up those stakes. So you were probably feeling that, because it always makes me laugh where someone's like, well, if I do this at the midpoint of my story, how am I going to make things worse? And it feels hard, but like, that's what it means to be a writer. We have to figure that out.
Yeah, I think in the first version of this in my mind, a long time ago, it was a very basic story. And when I started making the outline, I pulled a lot of the big surprises forward so that it became more engaging.
Yeah.
And by the time you hit the midpoint, you've used it all up. Everything you had is basically there. And so that's when I think you get into, well, what's the story really about? And what are the real problems here? And that powers you through the second part of Act 2. So funnily enough, I'm now doing another outline. I now know what to expect a bit more.
Yeah.
But the first time round is kind of terrifying.
Yeah, especially too, like you said, if you're doing it without talking to another writer, or if you're doing it just by yourself, you don't have anyone to sit there and say like, oh yeah, that's normal, James, don't worry. That's part of why I wanted to do episodes like this for the podcast, is just to show other people who are in their writing cave alone that this kind of stuff happens, and that you're not weird if your act 1 is a little shaky. And if you realize you're getting better in act 2, that's pretty normal. It's not a trick of the eye. But okay, so then I'm fast forwarding again. You got some feedback. I have some notes on the highlights of the feedback, but what was that process like because you went into this thinking, I don't really know what else to do to make it better?
Yeah, fundamentally, I had some thoughts around things, but I'm just too close to the material at that point. I could have just got into a loop of just moving things around and never gotten out of it. And so I do think having that second pair of eyes for me was critical, because your feedback throughout has been razor sharp. You can look at outlines, you can look at chapters and immediately pull things out that other people either wouldn't, or it'd take them forever. And so that speed of being able to say, well, I see how this pairs up with the thousands of other books you've read really makes all the difference. And so that to me was the course correction, where I was able to get out again and say, well, yeah, that seems to, and then when you explained a lot of the things to me, it was very much common sense exercise of going, I agree with that. This could be better.
I remember too that we agreed, or like you were like, yeah, I knew that was, maybe I needed to flesh that out more, or I had that instinct too. So it was kind of fun to see that in a way there was nothing surprising. It was just, you needed that objectivity of like, here's why you're feeling that way.
Yeah.
Right. Like, here's the actual craft reason why you feel that way. And here's what we can do to tweak it. So the 3 things I highlighted that I remember is that we had to talk about the age range, because you said a teen. So you've landed on, it's going to be a young adult book.
Yep.
And I remember in the draft, it was questionable. Is he adult? Is he young adult? So you've landed on that. The other thing was consistency with his character, I think, because the way, and I believe the issue was in Act 1. So you had a character who by the end had a really nice arc, but the beginning of his arc was a little muddy. It had a couple different things going on. So, and the reason I'm calling out these issues is to show like, these are next level problems. These are good things to be having with your first draft. If you have a draft that is quality, and then you get to this level of seeing these kind of issues, that's a cool thing to me. Yeah. It's not saying like your story's fundamentally broken.
Right. And I think when you said these things, I kind of knew secretly anyway, because the first 5 chapters, you're finding your way. And then I think I held on to those chapters being a bit too precious, because they were the first. And in reality, they just need torpedoing in places and just to fix them, because they don't really match the later material quite as well. But there is a sentimentality factor of just, well, this was such a good scene in my head when I started it, and it's very hard to step away from that.
Well, and I think it represents a nice or like precious time in your life when you sat down to finally write this, And I see this with a lot of writers. They want to hold on to the opening scenes, and it's, maybe because you thought it was a good idea, but also maybe because it represents taking action on your dreams, So anyway, I think it was cool that to produce a draft. I remember telling you, like, this is a really good quality draft, and it's not, let's fix the broken things. It's let's make things better.
Yeah.
So like, what was that like to hear?
Great, actually. I mean, I think, I always said to you, just give me the direct truth. I don't need sugarcoating or anything. And I think knowing that, what can be fixed or to make things better is great. Because I mean, everything all the time.
Yeah.
I think if you'd said, there's absolutely fundamental problems with this story all over, that would have been a surprise to me. I would have thought, oh God, I've really messed this up. But that's not really what happens. I know when you're waiting for feedback, the ride of like, oh my God, what's coming back?
Right.
But I think what you said was very much in line with some of the things I'd suspected, but also surprising in terms of some of the things you suggested that were really helpful. And I read it when I first got your feedback. I think I read it about 10 times. I first powered through the whole thing.
Yeah, looking for the bad, I'm sure.
Yeah, where's the bad here?
Yeah.
And then, but going over it, I kept thinking, yeah, this could really work. And it just fired off lots of new ideas in terms of making the story more seamless.
Yeah. And that's the fun part. I want to zoom out and talk about like editors in general, not just me, but any editor or book coach you're going to work with. Ideally, they can see the vision that a writer has for their story and then say, okay, here's what you have. And if you want to make it this, here's what you can do, So a lot of people are scared to work with editors because they don't want their story totally torn down, but that's not an editor's intent. An editor's intent is like, okay, you want to do this? Let's make it this. I'm excited to do it with you.
Yeah. And I think, being practical, you're working in a space where the quality bar is very high. We watch things on TV, you read books all the time. The stories work fundamentally.
Yeah.
And, you don't want to be in a position where you make mistakes that are, that betray your reader fundamentally. So I think it's important to have, if you're going to do this seriously, whether you self-publish or publish for an author, you've got to realize you're in the Olympics and you need to get every piece of help you can to get that bar as high as possible.
Well, and I always like to compare it to random stuff. Like the one I go to is building a house. If you're going to build a house to live in, you want that house to be pretty darn secure. Yeah. And you want the rooms to work. You want the stairs to work, right? So to me, I'm like, let's collectively decide that writing's as important as building a house. And if it's our dream, let's take it seriously,
Yeah, I think some people may have a fear of editors or just the process because they think it's like being at school where someone's going to come along and put a comma here and your grammar's terrible here, right? And kind of rip you apart that way. And that's really not the process. This is much more of a sort of meta level process of just timing in the story, what various characters are doing and thinking.
Right.
And it's not probably what most people think.
I think so too. And I'll say a caveat. I'm sure there are editors out there who do that. So if you've had that experience, we're not trying to diminish. But if you find a good editor, an editor who really cares, which I know there are many out there, I always like to compare it as like, I'm your writing buddy now. So I'm going to help whoever I'm working with, in this case, James, I'm going to help him make his vision. Yeah. And that's the kind of editor or whatever agent, whatever person you're, going for, that's who you want on your side, is someone that's going to help you get your vision across the finish line.
Yeah.
So speaking of all that and the finish line, how is the second draft going now?
So I took a month off, right? I completely did nothing for a month. And I just started into revisiting the outline. So I've gone into how that's going to look. And I'm much more confident going into the outline the second time around. I think you wonder, is it going to be very, very difficult? But I think it's really clicking into place. And now I'm getting to the point where I start the scheduling of how do I find the time each day, but I'm just revisiting that again. But the last couple of weekends, I started looking at how to get this outline into the right shape. And it's funny, I was tempted to go into scene by scene without touching the outline.
Yeah.
But then I thought, there's too many things moving here that I really need to make sure the outline's working, because that's what saved me the first time around on this.
Right.
And so I started there.
And just in case listeners aren't sure what you mean, so you have a full draft that's done, you've had feedback, you're going back to your original outline that you wrote from, probably updating that to make sure it just all matches, and then saying, what kind of big picture changes do I want to make? And you're walking yourself through the exercise of, let's say in chapter 5, something in the logic of the story changes. So then you're going forward with that logic of, if I change it in 5, what would that look like in chapter 6, 7, 8, 9?
Yeah.
On the outline.
Yeah.
Okay.
You'd also, this piece of advice you'd given a while back, but it was really good advice, is that keeping your outline up to date was essential. Because I think the problem is there's a drift that happens between your outline and what you're writing. And if you don't keep the outline up to date, even though it's a pain and it's not very interesting, you end up with it not being a very accurate representation. And when you want to look at like what scenes are affected by various things, it's not going to help you. So my outline was up to date when I finished the draft. And I think just keeping it up to date with the new version is critical.
Yeah. And personally, if I'm looking at my story, I like to update it after I finish a scene or at the end of a week. Maybe I've finished 3 scenes, whatever. I'll go back and I'll just make sure that, come that next week, no matter if I've done it daily or weekly, that outline matches what I've written. And that helps. Did you do any of that during the writing process? Like, let's say you made a change in chapter 5 when you wrote the scene. Did you change the outline going forward while you were writing?
Not originally. And then it's a comment you'd made a few weeks later, just generally to the group, right? I thought that was interesting. So I went back and I was really surprised to see how much my work was not reflecting the outline. It just drifted so far. So I started to be much more rigorous about keeping the outline to date. But honestly, it saves you, because when you get into the size of these novels, and you need to understand what's happening in various places, you can't go through the pages. You've got 30 or 40 files in Word or Google Docs, whatever you're using, and you've lost sight of where everything is at that point. And it's the outline that is your cheat sheet. Yeah,
it's impossible otherwise. And I think it's important to highlight what you just said, is that what you wrote was not matching your outline. And so you weren't using the outline as a rigid tool of like, I better get back to this. You were saying, let me update my outline to match my draft and then think through that logic going forward. Because a lot of people view outlines and they're like, well, what happens if things change? Just change your outline.
Yeah. And that's actually the trick, isn't it? Because most scenes, when you start writing them, don't follow the outline. There's something that happens. The characters aren't going to be forced through the hoops that you were trying to make them do. And something else surprising happens. And so that's fine. I think that's, I really learned to embrace that. But you do have to bring it back to the structure of the story. The two things have to really be hand in glove.
Right. And the only thing that happens if you don't do that is you're going to need more editing on the back end. Yeah. So the cool thing that I love about your story is that you did the hard work throughout the process of updating the outline, really making sure, like, even when you were outlining first, making sure that cause and effect was there, making sure the logic was there. Then when you started writing, you were diligent about updating it. And look at how fast you've been able to move through the process. Like, people think it slows them down, but it saves you so much time in the long run.
I couldn't have done it otherwise. I mean, I really think, had I not gone through this process with you, I would be still staring at a blank screen. I really think this roadmap is the way to do this. And I know many people will say, well, I'm special and I'm different, but I do think everybody actually does need to break the work in some way into bite-sized chunks and decide how to deliver the 500 words at a time, 1,000 words at a time. I think this process does work in that, as well as also making sure that you're on track with something that makes sense and is logical, tells well as a story.
Yeah, I think it's that. And it's also the mindset of being flexible, understanding it's not going to be perfect, understanding that you're not going to have all the answers right away, just going into it, not expecting yourself to have everything figured out or to be a great writer right away.
Yeah. So I mean, another golden piece of Savannah advice is the TK trick. So this one, it absolutely is worth its weight in gold. When you don't know something when you're writing, I can't believe you did that, she said, because of TK. Right. You simply put in TK and move on and keep writing. And this was an amazingly powerful trick, because fundamentally, otherwise you sit there for ages. Like, what is...
Yeah.
When you should be writing words.
If you don't figure it out, then you're like, what's wrong with me? I should just stop today. And then you get all frustrated. But TK, it's T and K. So because it's not found together in any word in the English language. So it's really easy to find and replace. And actually, someone told me the other day, there is a word with TK. I can't remember what it is, but it's probably one we're not going to ever use in our books. So it still works. But I thought that was funny. She's like, actually, there is one. So I'm wrong. But anyway, all that's great. And then, so what do you think is next? Like, what are your publishing plans?
That's $1 million question. I think you have a really good part of the course where you talk about the different options. I think have lots of surprises. People not been in the industry don't realize how it works and what the trade-off is between the two. For me, I suspect the self-publishing route might well be the one to go for. I think many of my audience read things on Kindle. It gives you that immediacy of getting out there, doing what you... I think it's, at the same time, I've struggled with it. I thought, maybe it's worth at least querying agents and seeing where it goes. I still veer towards probably self-publishing. When I get to the final part where the draft is good enough, I might just change my mind. The great thing is, of course, nothing's set in stone at this point.
Right. And I always like a hybrid approach where it's like, give yourself 3, 6, whatever months, and try querying, see what happens. You never know. And after that period, there's absolutely nothing wrong with self-publishing. I think that's a great route to go. You get so much more control that way. It's so much quicker to market and all that fun stuff. So you'll have to keep us posted.
Yeah.
Do you have plans for a book too?
I do, actually. So when I was taking my month off break on this one, I started outlining a second book, which is not related to the first book at all.
Cool.
And I found that as a result of doing all this, I had lots of ideas that are worth fleshing out and seeing where they go. And it's like the opposite of writer's block. It's just more of just, well, which idea do you want to do next? Because I figure this is something I'd like to do for the long term. And I figure, well, if it takes a year to write a book, more or less, or 18 months or so, there's a sort of queue of things coming up. And, what's the idea that will most hold your interest, really be most entertaining over that period? But there's definitely been no shortage of ideas I've got.
And that's so cool because I think it's like now you've been through the experience. So you have a level of confidence that I can do it. But also I'm sure there's fear there. I talk to a lot of people writing book 2 where they're like, yeah, it might be a little harder mentally, but I have all the tools I need to write book 2. It's just like, how do I compare to book 1? Now that I've become a better writer, what's going to be the next issue? And I always like to say, when you hit a new level, there's a new devil. So book 2 has its own new devil. But do you think after the experience of writing book 1 and taking the course and all this stuff that you have a toolbox full of tools?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, without a doubt. I really don't think it would have been possible without doing it. And I have read a lot of books on how to do stuff. It's my go-to approach to everything, to do stuff.
Yeah.
I think what was in the course enabled me to complete it. And the great thing is, if you've done it once, you can do it twice. So
totally.
I think the key thing is to make sure you keep using it, not just assume it doesn't apply to you anymore. So I've taken the approach of just doing exactly the same thing again, of stepping through the same rigmarole. I've reread the earlier courses again, make sure I don't miss things.
Yeah.
But it's a process. Fundamentally, if I keep doing this and a few years from now, I get good at it, hopefully. But I still feel that the fundamentals won't change. That actually these are the building blocks you need to be able to put the story.
Yeah. And that's so cool because in your mind, when you're sitting down, it must be nice in a way. And I have this experience too, where I'm like, I know what needs to go in a scene now. It's not scary anymore because I know the tools I need to pick up and put down.
Yeah.
And now it's like, I just filter my ideas through that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be smooth sailing every day I sit down to write, but at least it's not nebulous and overwhelming anymore.
And I think it helps pressure test the concepts to make sure that they're good enough to, more than anything, to hold your interest, let alone the reader. If it's not good enough for you to write about and spend a year of your life on, find another concept. There's a lot of things out there.
You'll be miserable.
Don't be miserable because you'll just end up not writing something that great. But I do think that approach lets you see, shake out the idea and make sure there's enough meat in the bone for it to be a worthwhile story to invest your time in. Then once you get to the point where you're at the scene level, I think that's the exciting part in many regards. The thing starts to come to life more, but just getting to that, you need to be sure that the idea has merit. And I think the tools really help with it.
Yeah. It's just it's a nice backup to have, you have the idea, you have the creativity. Now you have the confidence because you've written a book and now you have the tools in your backpack that just make it all possible. But the last question I have is, what would your advice be to someone that was you in December, or someone that's scared to take the next steps forward, or just kind of not sure if I can really do this thing like writing a book? What would you say?
Yeah, absolutely sign up for the course because fundamentally you have to invest in your skills to do these. And this will upskill you dramatically and probably get you through most of the self-doubt humps. But I think ultimately, we're not doing this stuff so I can be P.D. James or Shakespeare or Agatha Christie. You're doing it for yourself and you're comparing, am I a better writer today than I was in December? And the answer to that is undoubtedly
for sure
10 times better. There's no question. So I would say to anyone who's on that fence to take the jump. It's really more than anything an investment in your time and yourself to be able to turn this idea in your head into something that's on paper. And I think this gives you the best possibility of getting that done.
Yeah. And would you say that anyone's capable, do you think, of writing a book?
Absolutely. Yeah, I really think that's true. I know it's been a very sort of gatekeepered environment for many years, but everybody in the world has a story they want to tell. People love telling stories to each other. It's kind of the currency of humans. I travel all over in my job and people tell stories all over the world. It's definitely a thing people like to do. But I do think you just need to have the confidence that you can do it and give it a try. What's the worst that can happen, really? It's no real downside.
Yeah. And Speaking of confidence, I always say that it's not just having confidence. Sometimes it's just having courage, because if you step out into the zone of discomfort, the confidence will come the more times you step out. So I don't know if for me, when I do something scary, I always think about, okay, like what fictional character can I tap into and borrow their courage for a day? Because I literally do that with myself, because I'm an introvert. Some things are pretty scary for introverts. So anyway, so James, it has been super fun talking to you, hearing all about your writing journey. I know that I got kind of a front seat to it, but it was really fun to zoom out and just like recap all the awesome things that you've done over the last 9 months.
Yeah.
I mean, 9 months, that's crazy.
It's been extraordinary. And if I rewind, it's been a lot of work, but it's been without a doubt that one of the most rewarding things I've ever done.
Yeah.
And I found that it's something I'd really like to keep doing. I have my job, my personal life, and that's all good. I feel that this is a separate thing that I really connect with and I enjoy doing. Yeah. So to me, that's having the book is great, but actually finding the fact that I enjoy doing it has been even better.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I know that people are going to want to, see what you're all about and follow along on your journey. So where can people go to find you, learn more about you and all that fun stuff?
Best place is Twitter for me. So my Twitter handle is JBESW. My name's James Beswick, so JBESW, but everything I do is on Twitter and I respond to people who text me. I'm also on LinkedIn and every other platform.
Cool. And we'll link to some of that in the show notes. Do you have a website?
I don't yet. But
okay. So we'll link to some of that in the show notes just so you guys can get in touch with James if you want. But thank you, James, so much for spending time with me. And I can't wait to see what's next for book 2. I can't wait to have you back to talk about book 2, because I know that, maybe, I don't know, another 6 to 9 months, there will be a book 2. So it's very exciting. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Savannah. It's great to be here.
I hope my conversation with James has inspired you to keep going, even if your first draft or your first version of your outline isn't perfect. That was one of my favorite takeaways from my discussion with James, that he knew there were things that he wanted to fix in his draft, but he just kept going until the very end. And then his revisions were so much easier because he could finally see the big picture of his story from start to finish. So keep going, even if it's messy, even if you feel like you're pretty far in the weeds, and just trust the process. It will all work out and you'll be so much more well-equipped to revise your story into something cohesive and something that you're proud of once you get to the end. If you're listening to this episode right when it releases, the doors to my Notes to Novel course are currently closed. The program is getting a makeover during the holiday season, and it will reopen in early January. So if you can relate to James's story, or if you're struggling to get started, or maybe you want a proven framework to follow as you plan, outline, and write your first draft, then I would love to have you in the program. You can put your name on the waitlist by going to savannahgilbo.com/waitlist, and then you'll be the first to hear about it when doors open in early January. And if you're already enrolled in the course, then get excited because you get the updated version at no additional cost to you. So that's one of the great things about the Notes to Novel course. You will always get the updates for free once you're enrolled. So if you want to get on the waitlist, go to savannahgilbo.com/waitlist, and you'll be notified when doors open in January. So that's it for today's show. As always, I want to thank you so much for tuning in and showing your support. If you want to check out any of the links I mentioned in this episode, you can find them over at savannahgilbo.com/podcast. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe to the show because there's going to be another brand new episode coming out next week. If you're an Apple user, I'd really appreciate it if you took a few seconds to leave a quick rating and review. Your ratings and reviews tell iTunes that this is a podcast that's worth listening to. And in turn, that helps this show get in front of more fiction writers just like you. So that's it for today's show. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Until then, happy writing.